As Francesco said, I have spent the past 15 years studying international peace-building initiatives, so mostly in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and also in various other African and non-African countries. And during this fieldwork, I constantly witnessed a puzzling pattern, which is that international interveners kept using, reproducing, perpetuating ways of working that they themselves widely viewed as inefficient, ineffective, or even counterproductive. And by interveners, I mean expatriates who work in peace building. So that includes donors, diplomats, United Nations peacekeepers, other United Nations staff members, and the foreign staff of international and non-governmental organizations. For instance, it is now conventional wisdom, as the ambassador said, that local ownership is essential for successful peace building. But local stakeholders are rarely included in the design of international programs. Scholars and practitioners regularly emphasize that using universal peace-building templates is ineffective, and that context sensitivity is crucial. And yet, interveners often use models that have worked in other conflict zones, but that are not appropriate for the specific local conditions. Local people and interveners themselves deplore the expatriates' tendency to live in a kind of bubble where they interact mostly with other expatriates and where they lack contact with host populations. And yet, this phenomenon still happens in virtually all areas of intervention. Why? My book, Peaceland, is an attempt at understanding why international interveners contribute to perpetuating these modes of operation that they know, that we all know, are inefficient, ineffective, counterproductive, and that cannot help local populations build peace. What I also found striking when I was in the field is that a number of individuals and organizations ignore or even actively challenge the international peace builders' dominant practices, and they suggest alternative modes of operation. And the existence of these exceptional cases raises two questions for me. First, what can we learn from them in terms of increasing the effectiveness of international peace building and better helping host populations build peace? And second, why haven't they managed yet to convince their colleagues to adopt the alternative modes of operation that have proved to be more effective? The dominant explanations for the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of international peace building usually focus on material constraints, vested interests, and the imposition of liberal templates and values. What I found in my research, and the central message of the book, is that the everyday dimensions of international peace-building initiatives on the ground also tremendously affect peace-building effectiveness. And by everyday dimensions, I really mean mundane elements. I mean the expatriates' social habits, their standard security procedures, their habitual approaches to collecting information on violence. I also look a lot at the influence of the informal and the personal on formal professional initiatives. And in my book, I showed that everyday practices shape the overall intervention from the bottom up. They enable, they constitute, they help reproduce the macro-level policies, strategies, institutions, discourses that other political scientists usually study. They also explain the existence and the perpetuation of ways of working that interveners themselves widely view as inefficient, ineffective, even counterproductive. And I want to clarify from the start that my approach and existing explanations, of course, are not mutually exclusive, but rather they're complementary. So the first part of my book studies the everyday manner in which international peace builders make sense of their environments. And I first focus on the struggle over which and whose knowledge matters in Peaceland. In the current international system, the most valued expertise is that of interveners trained in peace building, humanitarian, and development techniques, and with extensive experience in a variety of conflict zones. In contrast, and although there are exceptions, the knowledge of country specialists is usually much less valued, and the knowledge of local people is usually trivialized. So this has positive intended consequences that increase peace-building effectiveness, but also negative unintended consequences that decrease effectiveness and create enormous local resistance. The next chapter studies the everyday manner in which international peace builders try to understand their work environment. And I show that international peace builders face multiple obstacles when they try to collect and analyze data on their areas of deployment. And I trace the key consequences of the resulting lack of understanding of local context. And one of these key consequences is that the lack of understanding of local conditions entices international peace builders to focus on simple and often overly simplistic narratives to design their intervention strategies, and that has numerous counterproductive consequences. So the second part of the book studies the everyday elements that make possible the counterproductive practices and narratives that I just told you about. And I look at the intended consequences of these routines, such as enabling interveners to function in conflict zones and enabling their organizations to help the host country build peace. But I also look at the unintended consequences, notably the fact that these everyday routines construct and maintain firm boundaries, a firm separation between interveners and local people. And the fact that they perform, they make visible, they perpetuate, they reinforce an image of the intervener superiority over local populations, which these populations obviously strongly resent, and again, that leads to resistance and rejections. So the everyday practices and routines that I analyze include the expatriates' personal and social experience living and working in conflict zones, the patterns of social relationships among interveners, but also between them and local populations, the interveners' standard security routines, their advertisement of their actions, their focus on neutrality and impartiality, and their focus on quantitative and short-term results. And throughout the book, I emphasize all of the exceptions to the dominant ways of thinking and acting that I describe. I show that interveners are much more effective, for instance, when they value local knowledge on par with thematic expertise, when they develop personal and social relationships with their local counterparts, and when they forego standard security routines and the requirement to advertise their actions. So overall, my latest research project suggests a new approach to understanding the effectiveness of international peace building, an approach focused on the everyday practice of peace building on the ground. This new approach suggests a fresh answer to the question of what we can do to better help host populations build peace. Macro-level policies, strategies, institutions, discourses are not the only determinant of peace-building effectiveness. The everyday practice of peace-building on the ground also matters tremendously. And it is by looking at these everyday practices and habits that we can understand why interveners contribute to perpetuating modes of operation that they know, that we all know, are inefficient, ineffective, or even counterproductive. Everyday practices, habits, narratives are perfectly understandable responses to the daily difficulties of intervening on the ground in conflict zones. They enable interveners to function in the difficult environments that they face, but they also have numerous counterproductive consequences that decrease the effectiveness of international peace efforts. So, what can we learn from these research findings in terms of improving our ability to better help host populations build peace? Well, international peace builders could rebalance the role of local and thematic knowledge by following the example of the exceptional organizations that I mentioned. So concretely, that would mean changing recruitment and promotion practices for international interveners, relying more on local employees, and creating tools and structures to gather local input from local communities and intended beneficiaries. We could also help break the boundaries between interveners and local people by, again, creating tools and structures for better relationships between interveners and local populations, by encouraging interveners to socialize with their local counterparts, and by convincing international peace builders to forego standard security routines and the requirement to advertise their actions. And local populations could further help break these boundaries by changing the way they routinely interact with international peace builders. Thank you.